Yeah, good question. So to answer it succinctly, my background training in Egyptology, and I could say also broadly in Near Eastern studies. So I have also training in Hebrew Bible and other aspects of the ancient Near East, has basically given me a lens, sort of my default lens by which I read the Book of Mormon, right? So the Book of Mormon, of course, purports to begin in the world of the ancient Near East, circa 600 BC Jerusalem with Lehi and his family. So the book purports that its primary family or characters comes out of that world. By knowing something about that world, I have been able to situate the Book of Mormon in sort of a real world ancient context, if that makes sense, right? By the way, before I proceed, I should apologize. I'm recovering from a cold, so if I sound stuffy or congested, or if I start hacking up a lung, I apologize. I'll try not to be gross, but just a fair warning. But my cold aside, yes, as I was saying, my scholarship in the ancient Near East has helped me sort of reconstruct a real world setting in which I read the Book of Mormon, right? And so when I see certain textual features or themes or teachings or even actions that people in the Book of Mormon do, a lot of the time I can see very interesting parallels or convergence with the world of the ancient Near East, in the world, and that includes to an extent the world of ancient Egypt. And we can get some examples of that. As for vice versa, well, that's kind of interesting because Latter-day Saints bring some things to the table that scholars of other backgrounds or perhaps religious denominations may not have as much of a keen interest on, right? So, for example, Latter-day Saints are understandably interested in like ancient metallic epigraphy, people writing on ancient metal media, right? Metal plates or metal objects or things like that. So C. Wilford Griggs, he was a Latter-day Saint scholar who published extensively on this, and he's one of the few guys who's published extensively on this because as a Latter-day Saint, that's something that he brings to the table because he has an interest in that. So I suppose along similar lines, that's something I'm interested in. I'm interested in certain uh, questions about Egypt's interactions with ancient Israel that perhaps biblical scholars of other backgrounds may not have as much interest. And part of that interest is because, as a Latter day Saint, we know there's an Egyptian background to the Book of Mormon. So, sort of, hopefully, we can see those are some examples in both directions where this interest goes, right? Or sort of how my studies of ancient Near Eastern scholarship have influenced my reading of the Book of Mormon, how hopefully or ideally, my background as a Latter day Saint has brought some things to the conversation, to the discussion of broader scholarship.
I'll do the vice versa, how the Book of Mormon has shaped my Egyptian scholarship. So I remember talking with a colleague once at one of these international meetings, and the colleague wondered how I could possibly believe in the Book of Mormon since you couldn't go and see any of the places. And I pointed out that until after I'd completed my PhD exams, I had never been to Egypt. And so you can study all about a place you've never been before. And so, in many ways, even if you only have the Book of Mormon as a way, as a text of viewing that ancient civilization, you can also study ancient Egypt that way. And there are still sites in Egypt and elsewhere in the Near East that I've studied, in some cases fairly intensively, and have never been. So this whole idea that, you have to be on the ground in order to get a value out of an ancient record or out of scripture is fallacious. There are all kinds of people who study about the Bible, who know it really well, who've never been to Israel, and people who study about the restoration who've never been to Kirtland. And you have the record, and that is enough to generate faith and to generate scholarship.
What we're talking about here is what's called Hebraisms. That's a common nomenclature for this kind of thing. So, precisely as you just said, a Hebraism is a Hebrew syntax or sort of yeah, uh, linguistic or syntactical elements. That's what I'm looking for. Linguistic or syntactical elements in the text of the Book of Mormon, right? And this has been around extensively. Donald Perry there at BYU, he's got a nice book on this that came out a couple years ago called, I think it's like Preserved in Translation, Hebrew Elements in the Book of Mormon or something like that, published through the Religious Studies Center and Ezra Book. Um, so, broadly speaking, people probably have some familiarity with this. Do we see Egyptian evidence of this as well? And the short answer is yes, because many of the syntactical features identified as Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon also work as Egyptianisms, right? So the Egyptian language or Egyptian literary or linguistic features had a similar kind of thing. As a matter of fact, parallelism or chiasmus is one of them. So chiasmus has been identified in Egyptian texts. It's been poetic parallelism has been identified in Egyptian text, literary compositions, and so that might be an example of where a Hebraism can also work as an Egyptianism, if you want to sort of say it in those terms. But there's other interesting structural features in the Book of Mormon that also come from Egyptian. So back in 2020, I published an article through the Journal Interpreter, Journal of Latter-day Saint Faith and Scholarship. The title is Notes on Book of Mormon Heads. This is published back in 2020. And by heads, what I mean are sort of literary headings, right? That we get at the beginning of certain books in the Book of Mormon or textual units in the Book of Mormon. So as you're reading your Book of Mormon, right, First Nephi, it starts out, quote, an account of Lehi and his wife Sarai and his four sons being called from beginning of the eldest, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, Nephi, right? There's this lengthy kind of heading to it, right? The sort of preface to First Nephi. Second Nephi, an account of the death of Lehi. Lehi's brethren rebelled against him. The Lord warns Nephi to depart into the wilderness, etc. His journeyings in the wilderness, etc. So Jacob has one. Alma has one, Helaman has one, third Nephi has one, fourth Nephi has one. And then within certain textual subdivisions or units, you also have these heads, these content markers. So, for example, second Nephi 6 through 10 starts off with the words of Jacob, the brother of Nephi, which he spake unto the people of Nephi. That's probably original to Nephi, right? To Nephi or Jacob. Mormon does this throughout Mosiah and Alma. So Alma 4 and 5, the words which Alma, the high priest, according to the holy order of God, delivered to the people in their cities and villages throughout the land. Okay, so you have these heads, these heading sort of titles to the Book of Mormon. That's a phenomenon that's very well attested in Egyptian literary texts. Okay, so you have this phenomenon in ancient Egyptian texts of laying down these headings in order to either demarcate the titles and contents of books or scrolls, right? Or as sort of literary subunits to mark literary progression within a narrative. And in my article, I give examples of this that in some very interesting ways parallel what's happening in the Book of Mormon. Chapter divisions in the Book of Mormon is another structural element that has a nice parallel with what's in ancient Egypt. So, for example, specifically our 1830 chapter edition or chapter breaks, our 1830 edition Book of Mormon, first edition, right, published in Palmyra. Those chapter breaks, according to Royal Skousen's works, Royal Skousen is a Book of Mormon textual critic who's published on this for like over 30 years now. He's one of the go-to guys, probably the go-to guy for Book of Mormon textual criticism. Skousen, based on the original manuscript and other early manuscripts, makes a very compelling case that the 1830 chapter divisions are probably original to the plates. So they're Mormon's chapter divisions, right? Or Nephi's chapter divisions. The idea of giving books chapter divisions, we take it for granted as a thing we do today. It wasn't necessarily the case in antiquity. And so you have different ways where you can demarcate, quote, chapters within texts anciently. But the Egyptians do have chapters. They call it huat, enclosures is what they call them. And so we have Egyptian, especially poetic works, where we have a literally a huat one, a chapter one, huat two, chapter two. So it's in the instructions of Amenemope. It's what's the other example I post here? Anyways, there's other examples. Amenemope is the big one. I think it's in the Leiden hymn to Amun Ra. Anyways, punchline is it's in my paper. Punchline is the idea of giving a book chapter divisions. That's a thing attested in Egyptian compositions, and that's what we have in our Book of Mormon. Without getting too much into it, right? Nephi and others have some working knowledge of the Egyptian language. They're writing the Book of Mormon in a modified Egyptian script, right? Later it becomes called Reformed Egyptian. We can talk about that if we want. So very likely they have some kind of scribal, or almost certainly they have some kind of scribal training and background in Egyptian literary composition, I would think. And so that perhaps could explain how they sort of transmigrate this idea of chapter divisions, which isn't really a biblical thing. You get that later as the Bible is transmitted, but from antiquity, they don't really do chapters per se the way we do them today. They have other textual divisions, but that's an Egyptian thing. So there's another example, right, of sort of an Egyptian, I believe, an Egyptianism in the Book of Mormon. So if you're talking about literary or poetic devices like chiasmus or parallelism, or if you're talking about things like heads or headings or content markers, or if you're talking about like sort of chapter divisions, I think those are examples of Egyptian influence on the structure and content of our Book of Mormon.
So the Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon are also true of Egyptian. And there are a few that aren't, but most of them would work in either language. And part of that is because culturally they were next to each other and borrowed each things from each other. But I've even put that in print, that many of the things that are classed as Hebraisms are also true of Egyptian. And so a lot of them are not distinctive for determining whether or not whether the base language is Hebrew or Egyptian, since it really doesn't matter. To give an example, the if-and construction. Um, in late Egyptian, Demotic, and Coptic, you normally put the processes will have an F on it, just like it, and in Hebrew it'll have an F on it. And Hebrew marks the apodosis, what we in English think of the then part of this if-then construction conditional clause. The apodosis in Hebrew is marked by an and, but it's also marked in Egyptian using the conjunctive, which is an and sort of tense. And that's so it's both of them work. Now, in the case of if and, that's impossible English. And so that's an indication that the Book of Mormon is not originally written in English. But the case for the Book of Mormon being originally written in English has been complicated greatly by Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack's research that the Book of Mormon is written in early modern English, so pre-King James English. And Joseph Smith didn't know this stuff and didn't use the stuff in his own writing. He doesn't write in early modern English. And yet the Book of Mormon is mostly in early modern English. So it's not in Joseph Smith's English.
So that phrase actually comes from Moroni, and it's in the very last chapter in the Book of Mormon of the Book of Mormon. So this is Mormon chapter 9, which is written by Moroni, right? So be careful not to get too confused there. It's not Mormon saying this; it's Moroni. He says, we have written this record. This is Mormon chapter 9, verse 32. We have written this record according to our knowledge and the characters which are called among us, the Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. Okay. So, first things first, let's get something out of the way here. Sometimes, in fact, just last week, I had somebody ask me, uh, other Egyptologists don't really know what this thing called Reformed Egyptian is. They've never heard about it. If you ask them, hey, what's Reformed Egyptian? They'll kind of give you a blank stare. Isn't that a problem for the Book of Mormon? The fact that other Egyptologists don't know what Reformed Egyptian is? And uh, the basic answer is no, because our answers are in verse 32, which is called among us Reformed Egyptian. Okay. So this is a neologism that the Nephites, specifically Moroni and his scribal friends keeping the records, that's a phrase they use to describe this script that they've employed. Okay. So if other people say, well, Egyptologists have never heard of Reformed Egyptian, don't be too disturbed by that because this is something unique to the Book of Mormon. So I wouldn't expect other Egyptologists to sort of know what this thing is, right?
Mhm.
But he goes on to say, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. Okay, this is textbook abundantly attested what happens as languages evolve, scripts evolve in order to match the needs of the spoken language. Okay, so what Moroni is describing here is he and other Book of Mormon record keepers or Nephite scribes, people with scribal training, they are using a reformed or a modified form of Egyptian script, which is being altered to accommodate the spoken nature of their language, right? Whatever that may have been at this time. Okay, that's we see abundant examples of this happening in antiquity. Okay, the Egyptian language itself, the script evolved over time in certain ways in order to accommodate changes in the language. So that's not controversial.
The question of what Reformed Egyptian is difficult because there are half a dozen Egyptian scripts available in Lehi's day. Now, you could argue that the hieroglyphs are not reformed, but everything else is. And so, which, if any of those, was being used? And it's Moroni that says we call it Reformed Egyptian. And it's been changed over 1,000 years. So I'm not sure what it looks like. And I've often said that if somebody presented me with the plates of Nephi, I might have a chance of reading them. But after 1,000 years of changes, not only changes to the language, but changes to the script and to the handwriting, I probably wouldn't have a prayer of reading if you presented me with the plates that Mormon wrote. I probably wouldn't have any clue where to start without seeing the changes over time and being able to say, oh, this character turns into this one.
Probably the thing that stands out to me is the fact that this record is being kept in an Egyptian script that later they call Reformed Egyptian, right?
Mhm.
Um, the fact that we have these Egyptian names in the Book of Mormon. Some people like Hugh Nibley back in the 1950s and 60s, and some scholars today they point to interesting cultural practices in the Book of Mormon that seem to have some interesting connections with ancient Egypt. My favorite example is: do you remember when Ammon cuts off the arms of the robbers with the Lamanite sheep with King Lamoni or whatever, and
Yeah,
he
yeah.
brings them before the king, and he like they lay the arms before the king as a display of like this guy Ammon, he's this great spirit, he's this miraculous dude. This idea of like lopping off people's limbs and laying them before the king as a way to account for a victory in battle or something. That's attested in ancient Egypt. At Tel El Daba, Avaris, we actually found a deposit. I think there were like 16 right hands that had been cut off and deposited in a place we think was next to the throne room. At Medina Habu and other temple walls, we have depictions of this where guys are like piling up body parts in front of the king to account for all the people they've slain in battle. So, like, that's an interesting kind of convergence there, or an interesting kind of parallel. The other really fun thing to pay attention to in terms of Egyptian influence on the Book of Mormon would be the names. So, the Book of Mormon's onomasticon. And so there's been lots of scholarship talking about the fact that there are many names in the Book of Mormon that are either attested as ancient Egyptian names or plausibly can be reconstructed as ancient Egyptian names. So let's start actually with the name Nephi. John Gee, who you're going to also speak to, you can ask him about this. He's published on this, and others have as well, that Nephi's name seems to derive from the Egyptian word for good or goodly or beautiful or comely or something like that, right? And it's funny because Nephi, his whole thing is, I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, and there's a running leitmotif throughout his record of good and goodness, also fair in the sense of like complexion or beauty, right? So the Nephites are the fair ones, right? Nephi, oh my fair people, Mormon, oh ye fair ones. There's this ongoing theme between the name Nephi and goodness and fairness, or beauty and comeliness. That seems, I don't think that's accidental. And John has written on that. Matt Bowen, my friend, has written on that. So plenty of scholarship on that. How about you zip down in time for a little bit, and you've got Pahoran, Paanki, and Pakumeni, right? These three sons at the beginning of the book of Helaman, right? Who are all vying for the judgeship. There's the chief judge Pahoran, and then he has his three sons. Pahoran, almost certainly the Egyptian Paheri, which means like the Syrian, right? The guy from Syria. Paanki, that's an attested Egyptian name, the living one, the one who is alive, right? Pakumeni has been reconstructed as plausibly the Egyptian for the blind man or the blind one, right? So there's been some interesting scholarship to show that the names in the Book of Mormon, many of the names seem to have plausible Egyptian or attested Egyptian attestation, which is really kind of interesting. As a matter of fact, the great biblical scholar and archaeologist William F. Albright out of Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, he was so impressed by this in a private letter to a guy in the 1960s. He mentioned, hey, this is really interesting that this Book of Mormon has these Egyptian names in them, and it's connected with this thing called Reformed Egyptian, right? Albright didn't quite comment further than that. He didn't want to quite commit himself, but in this letter, he recognized that these are authentic Egyptian names. And that was kind of surprising to him. So there's something to also consider. That's an area of ongoing research, is the onomasticon, or the names in the Book of Mormon. And many of the names, like I said, have plausible or attested Egyptian origins. And so that also is probably interesting to sort of keep in mind.
There are lots of things that stand out to me. It's a challenge to come up with a good list. So, but things that stand out based on my Egyptology background, some of the rhetoric that they use. I've written a series of articles on what I call verbal punctuation in the Book of Mormon. In Egyptian, they don't put in punctuation for the most part, except by using particular words that help structure the narrative. And the Book of Mormon has that too. So they'll use things like and now, they'll use nevertheless, they'll use behold, they'll use yea, they'll use it came to pass. And all of these are little signposts that help structure the narrative. And when Joseph Smith originally dictated the Book of Mormon, there was no punctuation anywhere. And these words serve as signposts. But it was sort of back and forth between the Book of Mormon and ancient Egyptian, figuring those out. Other things that pop up, the whole writing on plates of brass and plates of metal, that is reflected in the ancient world, where metal plates are used for covenants. And this is most explicitly in a copy of an inscription onto a temple wall It's done by Ramses II, but it's a copy from plates on gold and silver. And it's a treaty between he and the Hittites. And it's a covenant of sorts. And the Book of Mormon is all to bring to mind the covenants and what you do in the ancient world. You've got a covenant, you write it on a metal plate. You might write it other places, and most of those are the ones that have survived, but you write it on metal. And we even have one of those from Hittites, where we still, it's the size of a sheet of paper, but there are about 350 lines of text on it, and all engraven on this metal plate, which is also pierced with holes so you can mount it or turn it. And there are some Egyptian names in the Book of Mormon. For example, Iriantum is seems to be an Egyptian name. They've been working on the onomasticon project. Onomasticon is a term originally from Greek, and it's a list of words, a list of names. So we had this Book of Mormon name projects, which started about over 50 years ago and finally came out just a couple of years ago. And there are a number of so a C9, for example, that Nephite measurement seems to be borrowed from Egyptian, where it is an Egyptian monetary uh, measurement. They have these curls of metal, and a certain weight of them is the C9. And that seems to be they're borrowing the term. I don't know if they're borrowing the unit per se, but they're at least borrowing the term for that in the Book of Mormon. So those are just a few.
Yeah, well, it's funny because my one of my favorite stories it has probably the least to do with ancient Egypt, actually, right? So it's not Nephi and it's not Moroni, these guys. I actually really, really like the story of Alma and Amulek and Ammonihah. So this is going to be like Alma 9 through 14 or thereabouts, right? The reason why I love this story, I mean, I could go on and on about why I love the story, but a couple of reasons. Number one, this is where you really see the human side come out of these people, especially Alma and Amulek, right? This is where you see their humanity really shine through in the text. And my favorite example of that is as they are watching the people burn, right? These righteous converts and Ammonihah, as they're watching them suffer this horrible death, you have two instinctive reactions from these two guys that to me indicates these were real people and that they have real kind of personalities. Of course, Sean, hopefully what Amulek wanted to do, right? His
Yeah.
gut instinct is reach out with the power of God and save these people. Amulek is a new convert, and he's just barely been kind of introduced to the gospel, the plan of salvation, and how this all works. And his instinct is, Alma, you've got superpowers. You have to save them, right? Alma, however, is a little more seasoned and mature in his understanding of the plan of salvation. He understands there's a broader scope or picture, and he says, I can't. I've been constrained not to, but this is happening so they can bear witness at the last day of judgment and so forth, right? But like that's a very human, impulsive thing to want to do. Like I very much sympathize with the Amulek, right? I'm seeing people suffering and dying. We instinctively want to reach out and help them. So like things like that shine through for me. I love the beautiful teachings that come through in these chapters, right? As Alma and Amulek talk about the plan of salvation, they talk about the redemptive nature of Christ, and it's chock full of these sorts of things. It's also interesting because this marked a turning point for Alma in many ways. This was a moment of where he matured and where he grew in his ministry. So, for example, Alma uses the metaphor of a fiery, burning lake of fire in his warnings against the people of Ammonihah, right? And then his converts are literally thrown in a lake of fire. They are literally burned to death. And the guy even says, "Are you going to tell us now, Alma, about a lake of fire?" Right? The wicked Lamanite king or whatever of the city. He says, "Are you going to lecture us now about a lake of fire?" After that, Alma never uses that metaphor again in the Book of Mormon. It never shows up again. So like that's kind of interesting to me. And that to me shows that something was seared into Alma's consciousness and he had a maturing sort of moment where he changed as a person. Anyways, I could go on and on, but we're running out of time. So I would just say Alma and Amulek and Ammonihah, Alma 9 through 14, wonderful story in the Book of Mormon, one of my favorites.
Well, that changes over time. So currently, it's probably the exchange of letters between Captain Moroni and Pahoran, which isn't popular these days. And a lot of people really don't think that Moroni, who's a general and used to barking orders, comes off as very gruff. And they're more enamored with Pahoran, who's a politician. And so he's toning everything down and trying to be conciliatory. But he does acknowledge that Moroni has a point and that there is a problem, and says that they ought to do what Moroni suggests that they do in the situation. But part of it that in the letters that those two points of view, the politician and the general, are very well captured. But uh, Moroni's letter is carefully worded and anything but brash, and he has some of the most memorable lines in uh, that exchange. Well, there are 4 volumes on the collected works of Hugh Nibley that deal with the Book of Mormon, and Nibley is also always worth reading, partly because he writes so well. So he not only has control of all of the evidence, but he writes so well, and um, most of the rest of us don't write that well, and so his is worth reading. John Sorensen's too big. Well, he's got more than that. So you do his Mormon's map, his approach to the Book of Mormon, well, Mormon's Codex, and his book on the Book of Mormon, the 80s, and it's slipping my mind what that's called. And he also did some other ones on it. His Book of Mormon geography one is not the Mormon's map is good, and that's good for a popular readings. His uh geography of Book of Mormon events is superb. Uh, if you want to understand geographic issues, the issues are laid out there. Um, Anything by John Clark on the Book of Mormon is worth reading. Um, if you're looking more at the teachings of the Book of Mormon, anything by Noel Reynolds is good. Um, and Royal Skousen on the Book of Mormon and his critical text has so much good material, and most people just go read his Yale edition and don't look at his analysis of the language, and they're cheating themselves by avoiding that. But if you really want to dig into the language and the text of the Book of Mormon, the whole series is massive and well worth looking at. Um, so those are the, if you're looking at names, then uh, Stephen Ricks and Paul Hoskisson's book on Book of Mormon names is a good place. Uh, the thing is, the Book of Mormon is so rich, but Nibley, Clark, Sorensen, Reynolds, Scousins, and Stanford Carmack are really the places you want to. And some really interesting work is being done by Matthew Bowen on the literary, how Book of Mormon names interact with the text of the Book of Mormon. Uh, those are the places to go. That's where I'd start. Probably that the most important book to read on the Book of Mormon is the Book of Mormon itself. All of these other things can help you understand it, but the text takes primacy over any of the analyses. And that you're better off if you have extra time, go read some of the scholarship, but read the Book of Mormon. It's it's your best guide to any history. And it's uh, a remarkable book. And it is the best place to get an orientation on this world and the next.